Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through the corridors of time. I'm Professor Somnus, and tonight we venture into one of war's most enduring mysteries: how Britain used cow dung to fight World War II. If you're enjoying these kinds of stories, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to give this video a quick like or subscribe. It might seem small, but it helps more than you can imagine to keep bringing you these tales of history and adventure. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. It's one of my favorite parts of this channel, seeing our little global community come together over these stories. Close your eyes, turn the page, and let history guide you to sweet dreams. During the Second World War, the entire British countryside was transformed into a landscape of secrets and paranoia, becoming a very strange place indeed. Picture, if you will, the rolling green hills of England in 1940, hills that had remained largely unchanged for centuries, where sheep grazed peacefully and farmers went about their ancient routines. But now, everything was different. To confound the anticipated Nazi invasion force, every single signpost in the nation was systematically uprooted by teams of local volunteers, leaving roads and villages nameless and utterly confusing. Ancient stone markers that had guided travelers for hundreds of years were suddenly gone, creating a deliberate maze of the familiar. Village names were painted over on railway stations. Road signs disappeared overnight. Even the names on shop fronts were obscured or removed entirely. At night, a profound and mandatory darkness fell everywhere under the blackout regulations, turning familiar towns into treacherous mazes where even lifelong residents could become hopelessly lost. Street lamps went dark. House windows were covered with thick black curtains or painted over entirely. Car headlights were reduced to thin slits of light. The natural rhythm of day and night, which had governed human activity since time immemorial, was suddenly and dramatically altered by government decree. In the midst of this eerie transformation, farmers, ever practical and resourceful, took to painting their cows with broad white stripes, hoping the ghostly patterns would prevent them from being struck by the few vehicles still daring to drive through the pitch-black countryside at night. Imagine these spectral cattle standing like zebras in the English fields, their white markings glowing faintly in whatever moonlight managed to penetrate the clouds. It was in this tense, surreal atmosphere, a unique blend of national anxiety and eccentric, almost comical creativity, that a particularly persistent legend was born. A story so peculiar, so audaciously clever, and so quintessentially British in its absurdity, that it has been lovingly passed down through generations of families, told in pubs, written in books, and shared on the internet for more than 8 decades. The legend, as it's most often told with great enthusiasm and conviction, is that British spies, in a dazzling moment of pure, unadulterated genius, devised an ingenious plan to disguise powerful bombs as ordinary cow dung to fool the German army. It is, you have to admit, a fantastic and captivating story that immediately captures the imagination. This tale paints a vivid picture of a seemingly peaceful European countryside with its ancient stone walls, meandering streams, and pastoral meadows, yet one that was secretly littered with hundreds of explosive cowpats, waiting patiently for unsuspecting enemy vehicles. It imagines a hidden network of sabotage, a secret weapon concealed in the most disgusting and universally overlooked object imaginable, ready to disrupt and destroy enemy supply lines from the quiet fields and farmlands of occupied France. The story usually goes something like this. British agents would carefully craft realistic-looking cow droppings, pack them with explosives, and then scatter them along roads used by German convoys. When a heavy military truck or tank rolled over one of these innocent-looking piles, it would detonate, destroying the vehicle and potentially killing the occupants. The beauty of the plan, according to the legend, lay in its perfect psychological camouflage. What soldier would ever suspect a cowpat of being dangerous? But like so many thrilling tales that emerge from the crucible of war, like the stories of ghost armies and miracle weapons that seem to multiply with each telling, the popular version that everyone knows and loves is just that, a legend, a compelling myth that has grown and evolved over the decades, becoming more elaborate and dramatic with each retelling. The reality, as we shall discover, is something else entirely, something stranger, more complex, and ultimately more fascinating than the simple story of explosive Dung. In this documentary, we're going to carefully peel back the layers of myth and uncover the real, top-secret operation that took one of the most repulsive things you can think of and truly did turn it into a weapon of war. The very idea of a cowpat bomb is so wonderfully absurd, it's almost laughable. Yet it possesses a unique and enduring power to capture the imagination. It speaks directly to a cherished narrative of classic underdog ingenuity, that distinctly British spirit of making do with what you have. The famous keep calm and carry on mentality that came to define the British war effort against a seemingly unstoppable and technologically superior foe. The story fits perfectly into our collective understanding of how Britain fought the Second World War, not with overwhelming force or superior numbers, but with cleverness, determination, and a healthy dose of eccentricity. It's the same spirit that gave us the Spitfire fighter plane, designed by a small team working in converted sheds, or the brilliant codebreakers of Bletchley Park, solving impossibly complex puzzles in a converted country house. But if you begin to search systematically for concrete, verifiable evidence of this supposed widespread deployment of Dung-disguised explosives, you'll find absolutely nothing. The official historical records, which have been meticulously preserved in archives like the National Archives at Kew, are completely and frustratingly silent on the matter. There are no credible documents, no declassified memoranda, no field reports detailing battalions of spies armed with explosive manure or grand strategic plans to camouflage entire airfields with cow droppings. This is particularly striking because the British were remarkably thorough in their record keeping, even for highly classified operations. They documented everything from the most mundane administrative details to the most sensitive intelligence operations. If there had been a widespread program of cowpat bombs, there would almost certainly be some paper trail requisition forms for materials, training manuals for agents, after-action reports from the field. This conspicuous absence of evidence doesn't mean the British weren't actively considering and developing some truly bizarre and unconventional weapons. They absolutely were, and the historical record is full of examples that are just as strange as exploding dung. The pressures of total war, combined with Britain's desperate situation after the fall of France, produced some of the strangest and most imaginative weapons ever conceived by military minds. There were carefully prepared exploding rats, designed to be discreetly tossed into the coal piles that fed the hungry furnaces of factories and railway engines across occupied Europe. The theory was that a stoker, finding what appeared to be a dead rat in his coal pile, would simply shovel it into the fire without a second thought, causing a devastating boiler explosion. There were entire armies of inflatable dummy tanks, meticulously crafted by teams of artists and engineers to fool enemy reconnaissance aircraft into miscalculating British strength and disposition. These rubber deceptions were so convincing that they fooled not only German pilots, but sometimes even Allied forces on the ground. They even developed and seriously planned to use a special kind of itching powder, designed to be sprinkled on the uniforms of German U-boat crews to cause as much discomfort, distraction, and general misery as possible during their long underwater patrols. The idea was that an itchy, uncomfortable crew would be less effective at their deadly job of hunting Allied shipping. So, in a conflict where exploding rats were a serious proposal that reached the highest levels of government, where itching powder was considered a legitimate weapon of war, the idea of explosive cow dung doesn't actually sound that far-fetched at all. It fits perfectly into the catalogue of British wartime ingenuity and desperation. But the stark lack of evidence for the cow bomb myth inevitably leads us to a much bigger and more interesting question. If the story as we know it isn't true, where on earth did it come from? How did such a specific and detailed legend emerge and persist for so many decades? Like all good and enduring myths, it appears to have grown from a very real kernel of truth, like a pearl forming around a grain of sand. And in this case, that truth is actually far more fascinating and ingenious than the fiction it eventually inspired. The real story isn't about spies trying to trick the enemy with actual cow dung. It's about a top-secret branch of British intelligence that had elevated the ancient art of deception and camouflage to an unprecedented level of scientific precision and artistic perfection. To properly uncover the real story behind the dung bomb legend, we have to travel back to the desperate, terrifying summer of 1940, when Britain's situation seemed almost hopeless. Following the catastrophic fall of France in June, which had shocked the world with its speed and completeness, Great Britain stood utterly alone, a final bastion of democracy against the seemingly invincible Axis powers, who now dominated virtually the entire European continent. The German war machine had swept through Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France with a speed and efficiency that defied all military expectations. The vaunted French army, considered one of the finest in the world, had collapsed in just 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, leaving behind virtually all of its heavy equipment. Now, Hitler's armies stood just 21 miles away across the English Channel, making final preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, with a conventional land war in Europe now impossible, and with British forces vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Prime Minister Winston Churchill knew that a radical new approach was desperately needed. The old rules of warfare, with their emphasis on pitched battles between massive armies, were no longer relevant to Britain's situation. What was needed was something completely different, a new kind of warfare that could strike at the enemy from within their own territory. It was in this context that Churchill authorized the immediate formation of a brand new organization with an innocuous name that hid its revolutionary purpose: the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Their tasks would be espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance, hitting the enemy where they least expected it, disrupting their operations, and making their occupation of Europe as costly and difficult as possible. But they faced an enormous, fundamental problem that conventional military forces never had to consider. How do you possibly arm secret agents who are completely surrounded by a hostile and vigilant enemy? How do you equip resistance fighters who might be searched at any moment by suspicious guards? You can't just parachute a French resistance fighter, a standard-issue British rifle with clear military markings. You can't hand them a giant, obviously military block of TNT and expect them to walk through German checkpoints undetected. Every single tool, every weapon, every piece of equipment had to be perfectly, utterly deniable, and capable of slipping past suspicious guards, random searches, and the dreaded secret police who were always watching for signs of resistance activity. This was the central puzzle that the SOE had to solve, and it required a complete rethinking of what a weapon could be. They needed sabotage devices that could hide in plain sight, blending seamlessly into the background of everyday life. Their revolutionary goal was to turn the mundane world into a potential minefield for the occupying forces. Under this new philosophy of invisible warfare, nothing was what it seemed. A simple suitcase was no longer just a piece of luggage. It had to be cleverly modified to hide a clandestine radio transmitter capable of communicating with London across hundreds of miles. A fountain pen was no longer just a writing instrument. It concealed a tiny but deadly explosive charge. A simple pencil was transformed into a silent dagger, and a harmless-looking lump of coal, waiting innocently to be shoveled into a locomotive's firebox, was in fact a powerful bomb designed to destroy the entire engine. This guiding philosophy of turning everyday objects into weapons sparked an urgent demand for the most clever and ingenious gadgets imaginable. The so-needed devices that were so well disguised, so perfectly ordinary in appearance, that they could pass the closest inspection by trained security personnel. This wasn't just a matter of military engineering. It was a complex combination of art, science, and psychology. The formation of the SOE was a direct and forceful result of Winston Churchill's personal frustration with what he saw as the established, conventional, and, in his increasingly impatient view, overly timid approach to waging war. Churchill was a man of action who believed passionately in taking the fight to the enemy, and he was determined to strike back at the Germans on every conceivable front, including deep behind their own lines where they felt most secure. This new organization represented such a radical departure from traditional military thinking that it was met with intense suspicion and outright hostility from the established intelligence and military establishments. The existing spy service, the Secret Intelligence Service, had operated for decades under a philosophy of quiet intelligence gathering, careful cultivation of sources, and avoiding anything that might compromise their networks. They feared that the SOS amateur approach and deliberately disruptive acts of sabotage would compromise their painstakingly established intelligence-gathering networks that had taken years to develop. Similarly, RAF Bomber Command deeply resented having to divert precious heavy aircraft away from their strategic bombing campaigns to drop agents and supply canisters into occupied Europe. Every plane used for operations was one less bomber available for the systematic destruction of German industrial targets. The rivalry between these organizations would persist throughout the war, sometimes hampering operations and always creating tension at the highest levels of government. But Churchill passionately defended his new, fledgling creation, which quickly earned the unofficial but widely used nickname, his Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. The name was meant to be derogatory, suggesting that the SOE's methods were somehow unsporting or dishonorable compared to the clean, open warfare preferred by the traditional military. But Churchill embraced the term, seeing it as perfectly capturing the unconventional approach that the desperate situation demanded. To lead this revolutionary organization, Churchill personally selected a group of remarkable individuals, maverick thinkers, brilliant engineers, and battle-hardened soldiers who shared his vision of a new kind of warfare. Men like Colin Gubbins, a tough Scotsman with invaluable experience in guerrilla warfare gained during the Russian Civil War and in Ireland, who understood that irregular warfare required completely different tactics and mindset than conventional military operations. Another key figure was Major Millis Jefferies, an engineering genius who would become the central figure in the development of the SOE's most audacious and innovative weapons. Jefferies was a man who could look at any ordinary object and immediately see how it could be transformed into an instrument of sabotage. Under his guidance, the SOE would develop an arsenal of devices that seemed to come from the imagination of a particularly creative spy novelist. These were not men who were interested in playing by the old, established rules of engagement that had governed European warfare for centuries. Their explicit job was to invent an entirely new kind of warfare. One fought not with massive armies clashing on open battlefields, but with cleverness, surprise, individual courage, and a complete and total disregard for the traditional etiquette of combat between civilized nations. The people they recruited to serve as agents were just as unconventional as their methods. While the leadership may have been drawn largely from the ranks of the military and social establishment, the agents themselves came from all walks of life. There were journalists who understood how to blend into foreign societies, electricians who could sabotage power systems, chefs who could poison enemy officers, linguists who could pass as natives, and academics who brought analytical minds to the business of destruction. Most remarkably, and in sharp contrast to the conservative military establishment, the SO was far ahead of its time in its extensive use of women in frontline combat roles. While the regular armed forces relegated women to support positions, female SO agents were rigorously trained not just as couriers and wireless operators, but in the deadly arts of firearms, explosives, and silent killing. They served as absolutely vital members of resistance networks across the continent, often proving more effective than their male counterparts at moving undetected through enemy territory. Women like Violette, Chabot, Odette, Sansom, and Nancy Wake became legends of wartime courage, operating behind enemy lines with a combination of feminine charm and lethal skill that completely confounded the German security services, who were unprepared to deal with female combatants. These women could kill a German officer with their bare hands, then calmly walk past his colleagues at a checkpoint, smiling sweetly while carrying explosives in their handbags. The immense and unprecedented task of creating the specialized tools for this new kind of warfare fell to a secretive network of research and development. Workshops scattered across the British countryside, hidden away in commandeered country houses, converted stables, and repurposed industrial buildings. These facilities operated under the highest levels of security, with their very existence known only to a handful of people at the top of the government. The most famous and productive of these secret laboratories was Station 9, located at a requisitioned country mansion known as the Fife, situated in the quiet Hertfordshire countryside, just an hour's drive north of London. The mansion, built in the Victorian era as a private residence for a wealthy industrialist, had been hastily converted into what was essentially Britain's real-life equivalent of Coubranche from the James Bond novels, though these facilities predated Ian Fleming's fictional creation by several decades. Run by a carefully selected mix of civilian scientists recruited from universities and private industry, and military engineers borrowed from various branches of the armed forces. Station Ix was a place of incredible innovation and creativity. The atmosphere was unlike anything found in traditional military establishments, more like a university research laboratory combined with an inventor's workshop, where brilliant minds were given virtually unlimited resources and told to think the unthinkable. They were the undisputed masters of what came to be called technical sabotage, and their hidden workshops, operating around the clock, churned out an astonishing arsenal of bespoke inventions that seemed to come from the pages of science fiction. There were perfectly silent pistols, like the famous Wellrod, which could kill a German officer at close range without making enough noise to wake someone in the next room. There were one-man submarines called the Wellman, designed to infiltrate heavily defended harbors and attach explosive charges to enemy ships. There were even compact, foldable motorcycles known as the Well Bike that could be dropped from a plane inside a standard parachute canister, allowing an agent to move quickly across enemy territory after landing. All inventions developed at this facility were given the prefix Well, a seemingly innocent nod to the nearby town of Welwyn, but actually serving as a code that indicated the device's origin to those in the know. This naming convention became a mark of quality and innovation. If something had well in its name, you knew it was cutting-edge technology designed for the most dangerous missions. It was here, within the closely guarded workshops of Station Ix and other related facilities, like Station 12 at Aston House in Hertfordshire, that the real truth behind the cow dung legend was finally born. The brilliant engineers and artists of the SO didn't use actual, real animal dung for their bombs, as the popular legend suggests. Instead, they created fakes. Exquisite, meticulously handcrafted fakes that were designed to be completely and utterly indistinguishable from the real thing, even under close examination. The creative process was incredibly detailed and painstaking, requiring a combination of scientific precision and artistic skill that was unprecedented in military history, to ensure their creations looked perfectly authentic under all conditions. The SOE's specialized camouflage section acquired genuine animal droppings from various sources, including the London Zoo, farms across the countryside, and even from the royal stables. These specimens were studied with the intensity of museum curators examining priceless artifacts. From there, a team of artists and technicians, many of whom had been recruited from the film industry, where they had perfected the art of creating convincing props, had the decidedly unglamorous but vitally important job of perfectly replicating not just the shape and size, but the precise texture, coloration, and even the subtle variations that made each dropping unique. This was not simply a matter of making something brown and lumpy. Real animal droppings have incredibly complex surface textures, color variations that change with age and weather exposure, and subtle details that most people never notice, but that would immediately alert a suspicious observer if they were missing. The SOE's artists had to study the way light reflected off aged manure, how the color changed from the outside to protected areas underneath, and even how the texture varied between different animals and different seasons. For missions in the rural landscapes of occupied France, they perfected the art of creating horse manure and cowpats that could fool even experienced farmers. For operations in the arid deserts of North Africa, where different animals were common, they developed and perfected the technique of creating exploding camel dung that would blend seamlessly with the local environment. Each theater of operations required its own specialized products, carefully tailored to local conditions and wildlife. Inside these remarkably convincing plaster shells, the SOE's explosive experts carefully packed a powerful plastic explosive, most likely the recently developed Nobel 808. This explosive, which had the appearance and pliable consistency of green plasticine and gave off a distinctive but faint almond smell, was exceptionally stable and moldable, making it the perfect substance for this kind of bespoke sabotage work. Unlike traditional explosives, which were often unstable and dangerous to handle, Nobel 808 could be shaped like clay and would only detonate when properly triggered. The device was then armed with a simple but highly effective triggering mechanism, often a pressure-sensitive fuse that would activate when subjected to the weight of a vehicle. The engineering challenge was to create a trigger that was sensitive enough to activate under the weight of a truck or tank, but stable enough not to go off accidentally when stepped on by a person or animal. The camouflaged dung bombs were just one entry in a vast and often bizarre catalog of sabotage tools developed by the creative minds at the SOE's secret workshops. Each device represented a unique solution to the specific challenges faced by agents operating behind enemy lines, where conventional weapons were not only useless but actively dangerous to possess. Another infamous invention that perfectly illustrates the SOE's unconventional approach was the exploding rat. The plan behind this device was as macabre as it was brilliantly conceived. Procurement officers would acquire a supply of recently deceased rats from various sources, often from pest control operations in London's warehouses and docks. These unfortunate rodents would then be carefully skinned by technicians who had learned their craft from taxidermists. The empty skins filled with plastic explosive and then meticulously sewn back up to look completely whole and natural. An agent would then place the doctored rat in the coal pile next to a boiler in a factory, power station, or locomotive maintenance shed. The core assumption underlying the entire operation was perfectly reasonable. Any stoker, upon finding what appeared to be a dead rodent in their fuel pile, would simply shovel it into the furnace without a second thought, automatically triggering a massive and destructive boiler explosion that could disable an entire facility for weeks or months. The plan had an elegant simplicity that appealed to the SOE's engineering minds. It required no timing mechanisms, no complex triggers, and no direct action by the saboteur once the device was placed. The enemy would essentially destroy their own equipment through their natural, predictable behavior. However, in one of those ironies that seem to characterize so much of wartime intelligence work, the plan went awry almost immediately when the very first shipment of these explosive rats, was intercepted by alert German security forces at a border checkpoint. A suspicious guard, perhaps alerted by an informer, or simply displaying the paranoid vigilance that characterized occupation forces, discovered the modified rodents before they could be distributed to resistance cells. But this apparent catastrophic failure had an entirely unexpected and arguably more successful psychological effect than the original plan could ever have achieved. The Germans, now utterly convinced that Britain was deploying vast legions of explosive rats across occupied Europe, exhibited the captured specimens at their military academies as examples of British perfidy. They launched exhaustive, time-consuming, and resource-intensive searches for more explosive animals, diverting significant numbers of personnel from more important duties. Security forces across occupied Europe began examining every dead animal with suspicious intensity. Coal piles were searched with meticulous care. Factory workers were given detailed briefings on what to look for. The SO later concluded, with considerable satisfaction, that the immense disruption and paranoia caused by the discovery of the rats was a far greater strategic success than if the devices had actually been used as originally intended. The Germans had essentially been tricked into fighting an army of phantom explosive rodents. Another key invention that demonstrates both the ingenuity and the limitations of SO weapons development was the infamous grenade hand anti-tank No. 74. Far better known throughout the British forces by its distinctly unofficial nickname, the sticky bomb. This weapon was the brainchild of Major Millis Jafforis, who conceived it as a solution to the British Army's desperate lack of effective anti-tank weapons in the early years of the war. The device consisted of a glass sphere about the size of a cricket ball, filled with volatile nitroglycerin, and covered in a powerfully adhesive substance that could theoretically stick to any surface. The entire assembly was mounted on a wooden handle that made it look somewhat like a military version of a toilet plunger. The concept was straightforward but terrifying. An infantryman was supposed to run directly up to an enemy tank under fire, pull a pin to expose the sticky surface, and physically slap the bomb onto the tank's armor before a 5-second fuse detonated the charge. The weapon embodied both the courage and the desperation of the British war effort. It was tactically sound in theory, but horrifically dangerous in practice. The official Ordnance Board, composed of experienced military engineers, initially rejected the weapon due to numerous serious problems that made it nearly as dangerous to the user as to the enemy. The device was fragile and prone to accidental detonation. The adhesive frequently failed to stick to dusty or muddy surfaces, and the nitroglycerin filling could become dangerously unstable in extreme temperatures. But Prime Minister Churchill, who had a personal fascination with unconventional weapons and a tendency to override technical objections when he believed in a concept, personally intervened to ensure the weapon's production, despite the protests of engineers and the horror of infantry officers who would have to use the device. Some 2.5 million sticky bombs were manufactured and distributed. The weapon saw service with the Home Guard, Commonwealth forces fighting in the harsh conditions of North Africa, and French resistance groups, though its combat effectiveness remained questionable throughout its service life. The list of strange and innovative devices produced by the SOE's workshops seemed almost endless, each one representing a unique approach to the problem of invisible warfare. There were explosive lumps of coal, chemically treated and carefully shaped to blend in with ordinary fuel supplies designed to destroy locomotives when shoveled into fireboxes. These were so convincing that even experienced railroad workers couldn't distinguish them from the real thing. There were incendiary devices disguised as ordinary cigarettes, which would burst into flame when smoked, potentially killing enemy officers, or at least causing significant facial injuries and panic. The psychological impact of such attacks was considered as important as the physical damage. An enemy who could untrust even something as innocent as a cigarette was an enemy living in constant fear. The So also developed deadly pencil daggers, writing instruments that could be twisted apart to reveal a sharp blade capable of killing silently. There was special abrasive grease that could be discreetly applied to railway axles, causing gradual damage that would eventually bring a train grinding to a halt miles from the sabotage site, making detection and prevention nearly impossible. They even revived and perfected medieval weapons, like the caltrop, a multi-pronged metal spike that could be scattered on roads to burst the tires of enemy vehicles. These ancient weapons, originally designed to stop cavalry charges, proved remarkably effective against rubber tires, capable of disabling entire convoys and creating massive traffic jams that could paralyze enemy logistics for hours or days. The men and women who were chosen to wield these strange and dangerous weapons in the field were not supermen or action heroes plucked from the pages of adventure novels. They were, for the most part, ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Individuals who underwent rigorous and often brutal training that transformed them into some of the most capable and dangerous operatives in military history. The transformation process began at a network of secluded country estates, scattered across the Scottish Highlands and the remote valleys of Wales. Properties that had been quietly requisitioned by the government and converted into training facilities of unimaginable intensity. These locations were chosen for their isolation, far from prying eyes and curious civilians who might accidentally witness the unusual activities taking place behind their high fences and guarded gates. The physical training was grueling beyond anything experienced in conventional military service. Recruits learned to kill silently with their bare hands under the tutelage of experts like William Fairborn and Eric Sykes, former Shanghai police officers who had developed their lethal techniques during years of combating armed criminal gangs in one of the world's most dangerous cities. These men taught methods of silent killing that were efficient, quick, and left no trace, skills that would have been considered murder in peacetime, but were essential for survival behind enemy lines. Students learned to approach sentries from behind, to kill with improvised weapons, and to disable opponents without making any sound that might alert nearby guards. They practiced these techniques obsessively until the movements became as natural as walking or breathing. The training was designed to overcome the natural human reluctance to kill, preparing agents for situations where a moment's hesitation could mean not just their own death, but the destruction of their entire network. They also learned the complex and dangerous art of parachuting from aircraft in the dead of night into hostile territory, often in weather conditions that would ground civilian flights. This was the relatively safe sport, parachuting, that civilians might enjoy in peacetime. This was precision, jumping into small, unmarked fields in complete darkness, carrying heavy equipment, and knowing that capture meant torture and death. The navigation training was particularly intensive, because an agent who became lost in enemy territory was as good as dead. Students learned to navigate by the stars, to read terrain features in the dark, and to find their way across unfamiliar country using only the most basic reference points. They memorized maps until they could draw accurate sketches from memory, and learned to estimate distances and directions with remarkable precision. Perhaps most challenging of all was the psychological training designed to prepare agents to become masters of disguise and deception. This was simply a matter of putting on different clothes or speaking with a foreign accent. It required a complete transformation of personality and behavior. Agents had to learn to think like natives of occupied countries, to understand local customs and mannerisms so thoroughly that they could pass casual scrutiny from people who had lived their entire lives in those places. They studied regional dialects, local slang, current events, and even trivial details like how people in different areas tied their shoes or held their cigarettes. Every gesture, every expression, every automatic response had to be consistent with their assumed identity. The training was so thorough that some agents later reported that they occasionally forgot their real identities, so completely had they absorbed their covers. One of the most dangerous and technically demanding roles within the SOE was that of the wireless operator, whose average life expectancy in occupied France was measured in months rather than years. These brave individuals used specially designed suitcase radios to maintain a vital communications link with London, transmitting intelligence reports, requesting supply drops, and coordinating resistance activities across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The wireless operators worked under conditions of constant, grinding fear. German direction-finding teams prowled the cities and countryside, using sophisticated equipment to triangulate radio transmissions. The longer an operator stayed on the air, the greater the chance of detection. But intelligence gathering and coordination required regular, lengthy communications. It was a deadly balance between operational necessity and survival. The radios themselves were marvels of miniaturization for their time, disguised as ordinary suitcases or hidden in false-bottomed trunks. They contained transmitters powerful enough to reach London from anywhere in occupied Europe, but they also generated telltale electromagnetic signatures that could be detected by increasingly sophisticated German monitoring equipment. Operators learned to set up their equipment quickly, transmit their messages in coded bursts, and then immediately pack up and move to new locations. They developed elaborate security protocols, changing frequencies, transmission times, and locations according to complex schedules. Many operators never stayed in the same place for more than a few days, living like hunted animals in a landscape where everyone might be an informer. The training program was incredibly demanding, both physically and psychologically, and was specifically designed to prepare agents to improvise and survive completely alone behind enemy lines, where help from friendly forces was impossible and capture meant almost certain death. The psychological pressure of this training was enormous. Instructors deliberately created situations of extreme stress, uncertainty, and moral ambiguity to prepare students for the impossible choices they would face in the field. Students learned the precise science of derailing trains, studying the mechanical principles of locomotive operation, and identifying the exact points where small amounts of explosive could cause maximum damage. They learned the intricate art of forging official documents, studying paper types, ink compositions, and the subtle details of official stamps and seals that could mean the difference between freedom and the firing squad. Perhaps most difficult of all, they learned to live with the constant, gnawing threat of capture, torture, and summary execution. The training included realistic simulations of interrogation, where students were subjected to physical and psychological pressure designed to test their ability to maintain their cover stories under extreme duress. These exercises were deliberately brutal because the real thing would be far worse. So, did these explosive droppings, exploding rats, and sticky bombs actually change the fundamental course of the Second World War? Did they turn the tide of battle or alter the strategic balance between the opposing forces? The honest answer is that it's highly unlikely they did in any direct, decisive way that military historians can easily quantify or measure. The truth is, it's almost impossible to accurately assess the success of these kinds of operations using conventional military metrics. By their very nature, they were secret, small-scale, and designed to leave as little trace as possible to ensure operational security and protect ongoing operations. Official records were often deliberately destroyed immediately after missions. The most successful sabotage operations were, by definition, the ones that appeared to be accidents or equipment failures rather than enemy action. Unlike conventional military engagements, where success can be measured in territory captured, enemy forces destroyed, or strategic objectives achieved, the impact of sabotage operations was subtle, cumulative, and often impossible to distinguish from the normal wear and tear of wartime operations. A railway bridge that collapsed might have been weakened by saboteurs, or it might simply have failed under the stress of carrying heavy military traffic on tracks that hadn't been properly maintained since the war began. But this difficulty in measurement doesn't mean these operations were ineffective. Quite the opposite. The real strategic impact of devices like the Dung bomb wasn't about sinking battleships or stopping entire armies in their tracks through single dramatic actions. Instead, it was about fighting a relentless war of nuisance and nerves, a campaign designed to make the German occupation of Europe as costly, difficult, and psychologically wearing as possible. The overarching strategic goal was to disrupt, to delay, and to demoralize the enemy at every conceivable turn. Every blown truck tire on a remote country road, every mysteriously damaged locomotive engine, every inexplicable factory breakdown could potentially be the work of a hidden saboteur. This uncertainty forced the occupying armies to become paranoid and suspicious, to waste enormous amounts of time, manpower, and resources checking everything and trusting nothing. Consider the psychological impact on German forces of knowing that any innocent-looking object might be a deadly trap. A simple lump of coal could destroy a locomotive. A dead rat could blow up a power station. Even a pile of animal droppings on a country road might be an explosive device waiting to destroy their vehicle. This kind of constant, low-level threat created an oppressive atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that was itself a powerful and corrosive weapon. The Germans were forced to divert significant resources from combat operations to security duties. Troops who might have been fighting on the front lines were instead assigned to guard duties, checking coal piles, inspecting railroad tracks, and searching for signs of sabotage. Technical specialists who could have been maintaining combat equipment were instead tasked with developing countermeasures against sabotaged devices. The explosive Dung was just one clever tool in a huge and varied toolbox of sabotage techniques. It worked alongside explosive coal, incendiary cigarettes, sticky bombs, and all the other weird and wonderful devices produced by the SOE's workshops. None of these were wonder weapons on their own, capable of single-handedly winning the war, but used together, coordinated across hundreds of separate operations. They represented a campaign of 1,000 cuts that slowly bled the enemy. More importantly, these devices empowered local resistance groups across occupied Europe, giving them clever, deniable, and effective ways to fight back against a much stronger foe. A French farmer with a few fake cowpats could disrupt German supply convoys without needing military training or sophisticated equipment. A factory worker with a piece of explosive coal could sabotage war production without arousing suspicion before the moment of detonation. This democratization of sabotage was perhaps the SOE's greatest achievement. By creating weapons that could be used by ordinary civilians with minimal training, they multiplied the effective size of the resistance by orders of magnitude. Every person in occupied territory became a potential saboteur, and every ordinary object became a potential weapon. The cumulative effect of these operations made absolutely sure that even in the most heavily occupied and ruthlessly suppressed territories, the enemy was never, ever truly safe or comfortable. German soldiers couldn't trust their equipment, their supplies, or even their immediate environment. This constant stress and uncertainty had a measurable impact on morale, effectiveness, and combat capability. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who commanded all Allied forces in Europe and was therefore in a position to assess the overall strategic impact of resistance operations, would later state that the continual and increasing strain placed on German security services throughout occupied Europe by the organized forces of resistance played a very considerable part in our complete and final victory. This was not mere diplomatic politeness. It was a professional military assessment from one of the war's most successful commanders. The resistance operations forced the Germans to maintain much larger occupation forces than would otherwise have been necessary, tying down troops that could have been used for combat operations. They disrupted the transportation networks that were essential for moving supplies and reinforcements. Most importantly, they demonstrated to occupied populations that resistance was possible and that the German war machine was not invincible. As we reach the end of our journey through this strange and fascinating chapter of wartime history, it's worth reflecting on what the story of the explosive Dung reveals about the nature of total war and the remarkable ingenuity of human beings under extreme pressure. In the end, the popular legend of Britain using real cow dung to fight World War II is, in fact, a myth, but it's a powerful and persistent myth that conceals a much stranger, more complex, and ultimately more fascinating truth. It wasn't about using actual animal droppings as weapons of war, but about the incredible artistic skill and scientific precision of secret engineers and spies who could create perfect, explosive replicas that could fool anyone, anywhere, under any conditions. The real story takes us into a hidden world of country house laboratories, where brilliant minds worked in absolute secrecy to develop weapons that existed at the intersection of art and science. It reveals a war effort that extended far beyond the traditional battlefield, reaching into workshops where civilian artists created deadly masterpieces disguised as the most mundane objects imaginable. It's a story that says a great deal about the brutal, all-encompassing nature of total war, where every resource, every talent, and every creative mind was mobilized for the struggle against fascism. In this conflict, the traditional boundaries between combatant and civilian, between military and civilian technology, between weapons and household objects, became completely blurred. The story perfectly encapsulates the unique spirit and character of the Special Operations Executive, an organization that operated outside conventional military doctrine, that embraced unconventional methods, and that achieved success through cleverness rather than brute force. It represents a very British approach to problem solving, practical, ingenious, slightly eccentric, and completely determined to find a way around seemingly impossible obstacles. More broadly, it serves as a powerful reminder that victory in warfare doesn't always come from the biggest armies, the heaviest tanks, or the most sophisticated aircraft. Sometimes, victory comes from the quiet, meticulous, and brilliant work of scientists and engineers laboring in secret workshops, developing solutions that no one else had ever imagined. It comes from the immense personal courage of individual agents willing to walk down dark and dangerous roads, carrying weapons disguised as the most innocent objects. And sometimes, as this story demonstrates, victory comes from weapons so bizarre, so unexpected, and so utterly disgusting in their apparent nature, that the enemy would never see them coming, even if they were about to step right in them. The legacy of the SAO's work extends far beyond the Second World War. The techniques and principles they developed, the art of disguising weapons as everyday objects, the science of psychological warfare, the strategy of empowering local resistance movements became fundamental elements of intelligence operations throughout the Cold War and continue to influence special operations forces today. In our modern world, where technology has made warfare increasingly sophisticated and precise, there's something almost quaint about the image of craftsmen carefully sculpting fake cowpats in a country house workshop. But the underlying principles remain relevant. The importance of innovation, the power of deception, and the enduring truth that the most effective weapons are often the ones your enemy never sees coming. The explosive Dung may have been just one small tool in a vast arsenal, but it represents something larger, the triumph of human creativity over seemingly impossible circumstances. The power of ordinary people to resist tyranny, and the eternal truth that in warfare, as in life, the most unlikely solutions are sometimes the most effective ones. So the next time you see a cowpat on a country road, you might find yourself wondering, just for a moment, whether it's really what it appears to be. And while the answer today is almost certainly yes, it's really just the fact that the question even occurs to you is a testament to the lasting power of one of the most unusual weapons ever created in one of history's most desperate hours. And so, dear dreamer, as the echoes of history fade and the quiet of the night settles in, may your mind find peace and your dreams take you to places even time cannot touch. Until next time, sleep well and dream deeply.